Hello everybody. So now we will talk about the chapter related to internal migration, and this lecture is going to be divided in these topics here: introduction, concepts and definitions, measures and migration, domestic migration in the US, and then these two topics here are some extra readings about temporary migration in China, pretty much about internal migration in China, and some analysis of spatial association that I have been doing a research project evaluating internal migration in the US for between small geographical areas. So now I will cover the topic about the introduction to internal migration. So we talked before in the previous chapters about fertility and mortality. So the third way that populations change their size is through migration, the third component in demography. And the size of the population decreases in the area of origin, the area that the migrant left, and increases in the area of destination, the area where the migrant moved to. And unlike mortality and fertility, migration may happen on multiple occasions or never happen during someone's lifetime. Of course, fertility can also happen in multiple occasions or never happen throughout a woman's lifetime, but this is even more clear for migration, and because it's not such a common process of migrating from one country to the other, from one state to the other. And on the other hand, some people migrate multiple occasions throughout their lives, and we're going to give you some examples of this, the level of migration among different populations. So this topic about migration and the definition of migration has been studied for several years. So Lee, for example, in 1966, he defined migration as a permanent or semi-permanent change of residence. And in his case, there was no restriction. No restriction was placed upon the residence of the move or upon the voluntary or involuntary nature of the act. So it could be among different places, didn't really matter the distance in this approach, and it covered both voluntarily and involuntary migration of people. No distinctions is made between external and internal migration, and every act of migration involves an origin, a destination, and intervening set of obstacles. And distance is always a major obstacle, a major intervening obstacle that makes people be more likely to migrate from one area to the other. So this is just an approach, just some information to give you that previously not much restrictions were placed in terms of distance that we would set as the minimum to consider migration flow. And of course, migration can be related to both international and internal migration. But here in the US, whenever we are talking about internal migration, we have a minimum distance that we're talking about, and I'm going to show you in the following slides. And distance among areas is always a major factor that will make people be more likely to migrate from one place to the other. Places that are closer to each other, the probability of people migrating from one to the other is higher than people migrating from one place that's farther away from another area. So migration is the permanent change of residence, and we are here talking about residential mobility, moving a great enough distance that all activities are transferred from one place to the other. So if I'm talking about commuting, I live in one place and during the day I go to another city or another urban location to work throughout the day, and then I come back, but all my activities and my residency continue to be the same, and I'm just moving from one place to the other in order to work, that's not considered migration. So in order to be considered migration, we have to transfer all our residential activities, all our residency from one place to the other. And we have the distinction between international migration and internal migration. International migration is a move between countries, either legally or without documentation. And in this specific chapter, we are focusing on internal migration, the move within national boundaries. So we are moving within a specific country. And usually there is no constraint about people moving within a country. But as we're going to see in the example in China, internal migration in China, the government places some restrictions on people migrating within China, for example, from rural to urban areas. So usually there is no constraint, but it's not always the case. So how exactly do we measure migration? So here going a little bit more specific. Permanence usually means that you have been gone at least 1 year from the previous place of residence. So commuting from one city to the other just to work in the same day and going back at the end of the day to sleep in the place of residence is not considered migration. So migration means being gone at least 1 year from the previous place of residence and moving to another place. And the minimum distance of migration to be considered internal migration in the US, there is a really clear definition proposed by the Census Bureau. So the Census Bureau defines a migrant as a person who has moved to a different county within the US. So if someone moves to a different county, to a different state, this person is considered an internal migrant in the US. If that person moves within a county, from one city to the other within a county, or even from one house to the other within a specific city, within a specific county in the US, that's not considered an internal migrant. But at the same time, this is a rough definition about how we see internal migration in the US. But if we wanted to understand internal migration flows in order for policymakers, for example, to better plan how many students a specific school district is going to need, then our definition of internal migrant would be a little different. For example, from the standpoint of a local school district, a migrant would be someone moving into or out of the school district's boundaries. So a person, even a person moving within a specific county or within a specific city, but between different school districts, that person in this specific point of view here would be considered an internal migrant, because then that policymaker, that government would need to know that information to know how many, what's the demand of children to be placed in specific schools in a specific school district. So this is usually a standard way to define internal migrant in the US, but specific studies can define it in other ways as well. And we talked about mortality transition and fertility transition before. And what is the migration transition? It's the permanent movement of people from one place to the other, and usually is a response to resource scarcity in the area of origin, typically caused by population growth in the area of origin, relative to perceived resources in the area of destination. So this is, and it is closely related to the urban transition, because most migrants are moving from rural areas to urban areas, no matter where they are from. So that's usually a movement of people going from rural to urban areas. So that's an urbanization process. So whenever we're talking about migration transition, it's usually related to this urbanization process. And these perceived resources in the destination area, we talked about that before in the chapter about theories of demography, that maybe some people move from a rural area, for example, to an urban area, and expecting that they will have better resources, better earnings, better job opportunities in the destination, in the urban area. But that not might be the case. Maybe the person has not complete information about opportunities in their urban area, and they move from the rural to urban area, and when they get there, they get worse jobs, and they get even worse earnings than the situation that they had before in the area of origin. But this process of migration will keep happening, because these people, they have limited information about the place of destination, so they have this perceived idea of what's gonna be in the destination, and that's related to Todaro's research. Todaro was that economist that mentioned exactly that. If earnings from, let's say in a specific case, maybe average earnings in the rural areas might be even better than average earnings in the urban areas, but maybe people will continue to move from rural to urban areas because these people have the expectation and perceive that by moving to the urban areas they will have better job opportunities. So this migration transition from rural to urban areas might continue even if most people are getting worse conditions at the destination area, because it's related to these perceived resources. And the migration transition involves a process and a transformation. The process is that people move from one place to another, and this represents the migration flow. So we have migration flows, which is a process of people moving from one place to the other, and we usually measure that the flows of people from one place to the other in a specific time range. Usually can think about how many people moved from one place to the other from 1 year to the following year, or or in between an interval of 5 years. And the transformation is that the migration stock changes as people moved into and out of a given place. So as people flow from one place to the other, from 1 year to the other, afterwards, after a while, at a specific time point, we can measure how many migrants in total are in the destination area from a specific origin area. So that's the stock of migrants. So let's say, for example, that we measure the number of migrants moving from New York State to Texas, for example, from 2000 to 2001, from 2001 to 2002, 2002 to 2003, and so on until 2009, 2010. So we are measuring the migration flow from 1 year to the other, from New York State to Texas. And then we can also do the analysis, okay, in 2010, also after all those flows that we measured before, in 2010, how many people in total moved are living in Texas who came from New York State? So in 2010, right now, how many people in Texas moved from New York State? So that's a stock, the amount of people that we have at the end of a specific time point, a time interval. And the migration process is a complex process in which we try to explain why people migrate. So this is a summary of a conceptual model of migration decision making. So there are several factors that influence the propensity of someone to migrate, and they influence actually motivation to migrate, and then we have the final decision of people migrating to one place or not, to another place or not. In terms of the propensity to migrate, we have individual level variables, household level variables, and community level variables. And all these variables, they will give to people some ideas of, like, to motivate the migration. They will give some benefits of migration if someone has better educational outcomes, or if someone has a family that already migrated before, or if someone has friends in the area of destination, these are all benefits that will make people migrate from one area to the other. On the other hand, they might have some characteristics that will make them less likely to migrate because it imposes some costs and constraints. And all those influence the intentions of migration, and then finally, all of this influence the final migration behavior, the decision to migrate. And as we did for fertility, we can also think about the proximate determinants of migration, the migration decision. We usually have these major contextual factors that influence some proximate determinants of migration, and then those proximate determinants will influence the final migration outcome. And the final migration outcome, we can estimate it in migration rates by age groups, which are called these migration age profiles. So as we talk in the case of fertility, we have these major contextual factors, social, economic, demographic, cultural, and religious factors that influence a series of other characteristics of the people when they entered into college, for example, into high school, when they complete college, when they enter in the labor force after finishing college or after finishing high school, for example, or when they get married, when there is an new formation, when they start cohabiting, when they start to have children, or at what age usually do they get divorced, and when do usually children leave their household for these children to then start going to college, and when do usually people retire. So all these life course transitions, they are influenced by these major contextual factors, and these specific determinants here, they influence the decision to migrate, and they influence the migration outcomes differently by different age groups. That's why we can estimate these migration outcomes by age groups. And so internal migration is a geographical move resulting in a change of residence that cross a political or a jurisdictional boundary. And here in the US, usually internal migration is considered a migration of people moving from one county to the other, so usually a county-type geographical unit in a country. So that's the definition specifically in the US. And over time, migration is a story of rural population growth leading to a redundancy of that population. So people start moving to other areas, usually to urban areas, to look for jobs and life in these other urban areas usually. And that's exactly the process that we mentioned before about migration transition, about urbanization. And when you reach a point in which the population is almost entirely urban, already living in urban area, as it is the case in the US and in most Western Europe, people start to move between urban places. They start to move, for example, from big cities to mid-sized cities. They start to move from one big city to another big city, or from one big city to a mid-sized city, or vice versa. So the process of internal migration becomes more complex. So we might call this process as a migration evolution. So it's not simply anymore a migration from rural to urban areas, but it's much more complex. People moving between urban places looking for different job opportunities and some life changes. And this is especially influenced by individual characteristics. When those different areas within these countries start to be more homogeneous, more similar to each other, people start to look at opportunities for jobs in other places as well, as you start to have mid-sized cities with as many resources and services available and job opportunities for the population. Any person who changes his or her residency is a mover. Not all movers are migrants though, because a person can move within the same community without involving the cross of a political boundary. So like we said before, if someone moves from one city to the other within a county, or even from one house to the other within a city, the definition from the Census Bureau doesn't consider that person a migrant, but that person can be a mover. All migrants are movers because the residential movement of a migrant involves the move of at least a county level jurisdictional boundary. In the Census Bureau, demographers have estimated that a person in the United States may move around 12 times in one's lifetime. So usually people can have up to 12 moves within the US throughout their lives. So you see, as we talked in the initial slides, that migration can happen many times throughout someone's life or never happen. So the chances of moving within the US is still really high, 12. And of course, mortality happens just once in someone's life, and fertility can happen more than once, but nowadays, we don't see so big numbers for fertility in the US anymore, and we still see this possibility of a lot of moves, internal migration moves in the US for people even in current years. So we see that, like a mover, for example, someone commuting from one place to the other throughout the day just to work and going back to the residency at the end of the day, that person might be a mover in the day, it's a commuter, but it's not a migrant as well. And migration is also important because it has impact on both the receiving and sending communities. The donor area, the area of origin, typically loses young adults, which can slow down population growth in those areas. Because usually, as I talked before in the diagram about proximate determinants of migration, there are different chances of people moving by age groups, because like usually young adults have the highest chances of migrating. And so the areas of origin, they typically lose these young adults, which are the ones more likely to migrate, and that might slow down the population growth in exactly those areas. And the host areas, the area of destination, gains exactly those young adults, which can increase population growth and also increase youth bulges, and can actually generate some economic development for that country, because then you have more people in younger ages, in labor ages, that can benefit the area of destination. And remittances from migrants back to sending communities have become important to the economies of those places and encourage continued migration. So people move to the destination area, start to make some money, but they can also send money back to the area of origin if some relatives stay in the area of origin. Remittances studies are usually more typical when we are talking about international migration, but it can also happen in internal migration studies. For example, in China, people moving from rural to urban areas, as we're going to talk later in the chapter, they usually the father, the male in the household, moves from rural to urban areas, but the other members of the family stay in the rural area, so the father sends money back to the rural areas within China. So these remittances are good for the development of the area of origin. So the internal migration flows has impacts on both the areas of origin and destination as well, because some of that money is not going to be used in the place where the migrant is working. So that was the first topic on this internal migration chapter. So thank you very much.